Okay, so as I said, today we're going to be presenting about our research and the preliminary results that we have so far, the projects we're doing. Yeah, now. Yes, there we go. Okay, so today we're talking about how you sign it. We're looking at variation in South African Sign Language. So to give a little bit of background, the beginning of education for deaf children in South Africa began in the mid-19th century. The earlier form of communication, because we know that there was communication among deaf people before the establishment of schools in South Africa, unfortunately, we don't know anything about what that form of communication looked like. It has not been documented. Schools were founded in South Africa by different foreign religious orders. And so the influences from the sign languages that those teachers brought with them to South Africa are evident in South African Sign Language. For example, Irish Sign Language, British Sign Language, American Sign Language. So there was various different schools established by different religious orders with different sign languages used by the teachers, and so variation can be expected. And the question becomes, well, at what level do we see this variation? And we can see linguistic variation at all levels, so all linguistic levels, all levels of the language. At the lexical level, and this is the level at which variation is very often most obvious, right? In the different signs that people use in different communities, in different spaces. And this is not restricted to sign languages, right? Lexical variation is very common in spoken languages as well. And you'd be probably surprised to realize how much variation you don't notice in your own language, how many words there are for the same concept. And in addition to lexical variation, we also see grammatical variation, where the sentence structure, the way in which sentences are formulated, the different grammatical functions that different items perform in a language also vary from community to community, from signer to signer. At a morphological level, you see variation, the way in which signs are put together. And at a phonological level, so-called even accents. When it comes to signing, we see variation there. And at a pragmatic level, right? So meaning in context, the different ways in which meaning is constructed can differ across the language. Our focus today is on lexical and grammatical variation. And the question becomes, well, then, if this is what you want to investigate, what kind of data is needed to explore this variation? Well, firstly, you need a large amount of data, right? And you need different types of data, because variation is also affected by contextual features and factors about the type of language that's being used. So you need narrative data, stories. You need elicited data. If you're looking for specific phenomena, you want to elicit those specific phenomena from your participants. We need spontaneous conversations, because people sign or speak differently when they're talking or signing in conversation. We also need data from diverse users of the language. So you want signers of different ages to see if age plays a role in variation. You want signers from different parts of the country, because we know that region and school plays a role in variation. You want to also have variation in the type of signer you elicit data from. So signers who were exposed from birth to the language, signers who were possibly late acquirers of the language, and you want to see if that plays a role in variation. So what we have done, or what we are in the process of doing, is creating a corpus of signed texts, which we've labeled the SASL corpus. So we started in around 2019. Obviously, COVID put a spoke in the wheel of a lot of our data collection, but we have been able to date to collect quite a large amount of data and different types of data from a diverse spectrum of signers. And we've done this in collaboration with the National Institute for the Deaf in Worcester and various schools. And so far, we've collected 3 data sets. So the first data set is from our first project, which is elicited and spontaneous data. So we collected data from more than 50 signers, responses to a sentence repetition task, elicitation tasks for verb agreement and negation. We got the signers to retell cartoons to each other and to have conversations with each other. So here are some example sentences from our SRT. And a slightly more complex one. So what is SRT involves is signers watching videos of a sentence being signed and then having to repeat that sentence exactly. And this, although memory does play a role to a certain extent, what an elicitation task like this does is test people's grammatical ability. So whether a sentence in this grammatical structure is part of their variety. So if you can produce the sign precisely, the sentence precisely, it is an indication that that sentence, that structure is part of your grammar. And this has been tested in spoken languages, in sign languages, that this kind of task is a very good indicator of the grammar of a language. Our second project, which was together with a former student of ours, elicited data from 52 young adult signers. So the mean age was 22. And this data came from 20 schools across 5 of the South African provinces. And we collected data for 173 lemmas. So 173 concepts or words in English that we used to elicit the sign for in these 52 adult signers variety. And then our next project, which we haven't, this was also a third project that we did a few years ago, where we had a student collect data from 40 deaf children using the sentence repetition task. And what we found from all 3, well, from project 1 and project 3 specifically, is that there are various factors that influence the language produced by participants. Specifically, the age of diagnosis of deafness, that plays a role. But more importantly, the age of exposure to South African Sign Language. So the age at which a child is first exposed to the language plays a very important role. But length of exposure is also a factor that we looked at, the school they attended and the region in which they came from. So I'm going to hand over to Anne to talk a little bit more about the results from the project.
Okay, just thanks, Kate. Just showing you a map of where the schools for the deaf are across the country. Those names in red are the schools, and you can see that they are located in the south and the east of the country mainly. Right. Of course, project 2, lexical variation, the schools were across these provinces, as we just said, 173 lemmas were tested. What we found was per lemma, per concept, there was an average of almost 4 variants per lemma. Seems like a huge amount of variation. Remember, it isn't. If you really know about your own spoken language, you will see that that is also the case even where. Province does not explain the variety. And loan signs from other sign languages only explain a little of the overlap between the schools. No school has a variety that stands alone, so it's not that it's developed its own version of SASL and that's what it's doing and, you know, keeping the walls around it. No, that is not the case. The overlap between the pairs of schools, because we did a pairwise comparison, ranges from 30% to 73%. So there's, you know, quite a lot of overlap between the variety. The school is the most important factor, right? This we've just recently published in a paper. Okay. Project 3, the development in children. You see that there was age of diagnosis. There was a range between 0 and 6 years in terms of diagnosis of deafness, right? It is large, and it's larger than in many other countries. Age of acquisition, just a bit older than 4. And the range again was between 0 and 7 years, actually, right? So, and we did this study at 2 schools in the Western Cape. And what we found was, this is quite a lot of figures, but it was the exact repetitions was quite low, only 11%. There was a range between 0 and 50. If you take away the non-manual markers, and that means the raised eyebrows to mark a yes/no question, or the lower eyebrows to mark a WH question, then the percentage goes up. So this is one of the later things in acquisition you can conclude. But the number of manual signs produced was actually fairly high, so that it's not that they're failing at the task, right? The exact sign order was also reasonably high, 71%. The factor that related to higher percentage of accuracy is age of acquisition. It's not surprising to people who are in the field, but it is something that we need to get out there, because this means a child has to get into a situation where it can learn SASL as quickly as possible to, in order, achieve a reasonable proficiency. Please, oh please, departments of basic education, listen. Okay, they are deaf. I mean, they are not listening. Okay, so the diversity in the adult data, the project 1. We've got a range here of age between 18 and 47. Only 5 of our participants were born into a deaf family, but about 50% had been diagnosed at birth, but diagnosis had not resulted in going to a school or an environment where they could learn SASL. Age of acquisition ranged from 0 to 29. Okay. Length of exposure, also a big range, and 17 different schools across 5 provinces in this project. Okay. And so we looked at, for now, the sentence repetition task, the one you saw an example of just now with the, you know, she does not like milk and so on. So these tests have been developed for other sign languages. They're seen as pretty reliable and so on. In this test, there are 20 sentences which have different lengths and different structure, and they include non-manual markers, right? The eyebrows, the head shake, and so on. Again, participants are asked to produce an exact repetition. So we took a sample from our 50 of the 15 younger signers, mean age 20 years, and age of acquisition 0 to 20, nevertheless. Exact repetitions, you can see there was about 30%, but a range from 0 to 74. If you exclude the non-manual markers again, you can see that this goes up. The number of manual signs produced was pretty high, so the participants are understanding the task. The exact sign order, 73%, is pretty good. The factor related to percentage of accuracy, here it comes, age of acquisition. So this is really so crucial here. Okay, so just a bit more detail about what we found. The general sign order, as we said, was 73%. Some actually copied the sentences with exact sign order. We looked at the verb placement, and the model sentences all have the verb in the last position, in the final position. And this was what was copied. This very few orders put the verb in the second position. However, what we know from a colleague, Ella Wehrmeyer, is that that does not correspond to what she found in stories. She found a predominant verb second, so we are puzzling. Why is it that, okay, it could be to do with region, it could be to do with the setting being narratives as opposed to sentence repetition. The non-manual markers, that's in a sign language, you have a head shake across the sentence when the sentence is a negative. And 100% of our participants produce that head shake. So it's a pretty clear indication. To communicate an imperative when you're commanding someone to do something, 73% were copied with these raised eyebrows. So again, it's an indication that it's in a lot of people's grammars. 80% for raised eyebrows for yes/no questions, 73% lowered eyebrows for WH, and WH clef, that's too complicated, but that was just a bit low. Okay. So we can conclude the head shake is obligatory. Variation in the other structures, we want to know what's going on. Why is that being omitted there, or what exactly is the cause? Why is it not 100%? Could be variation in the grammars of where these young people have grown up. So this is for future study. We've got a lot to do. There can be individual factors in variation. One participant, and this is a real puzzle to us, had no use of non-manual markers involving the eyebrows. Her eyebrows did not move throughout the whole test. No. Had she had Botox? We don't know. Now, this is not a flippant comment, actually, because it has been remarked on, or it's been illustrated that deaf people who have Botox cannot do their eyebrows. And they realise they're damaging their grammar. Interestingly, that 4 participants who repeated exactly the non-manual markers, 3 out of 4 had acquired SASL from birth. So again, it's really indicating. But the sample's too small. Remember, this is just a pilot study, only 15. We've got all the rest to study yet. So what are we going to do? This is where Kate and I have to give each other support, because this is our life for the next 50 years. Okay.
Anne is very, very positive about that.
So obviously we're going to expand the pilot sample, and this is actually a current master's project. We want to compare the findings from the sentence repetition task to the findings in our narrative and conversational data to see whether it is, with the same signers, whether there's a difference there. And we're very happy that we have these different types of data so that we can make these exact comparisons between individuals. And we want to analyze the elicited negation and verb agreement tests. And again, compare those to the narrative and conversational data. So, working with our corpus, we have a lot of work to do. The development in children, 2 projects will be starting soon to collect data from 9 to 13-year-olds in the Western Cape and in Gauteng. They're master's projects, and they will explore also the lexical variation in the children from Gauteng, because we know, just to get some light on that. And we also have a project started on the acquisition in hearing learners. So these are called L2N2, learner, second language, second modality. Current PhD project, again using the SRT, but also 2 tasks for the comprehension of lexicon and production of lexicon. We want to see what's the influence of iconicity. Iconicity means when there's a resemblance between the sign and its meaning. Okay, So if I do the sign for baby, this is a very iconic sign. Most people out of context can guess what is meant. Okay, but many other signs do not have that iconicity. But how does iconicity help second language learners of a sign language? And some signs are phonologically much more complex than others. If I use a handshake like this, it is much more complex than using a handshake like this. So how does that work? So this is what is going to be studied, and we're very excited about what is going to be found there. So, thank you. Please ask questions.
Yes.
It went quite fast, and there may be technical terms that you didn't follow. Please ask.
Yeah, we're happy to answer any questions
Absolutely.
about the data, about what we're doing, and about what we plan to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yes.
You said that the school is very important right now, the language. But do you have teachers? Because in normal schools you have children going around the country, but I don't know whether that happens with, and also teachers going around.
So we need to repeat this question to make sure that the interpreter can interpret this. So the question is...
Thank you.
Yes. Schools are very important in the formation of sign languages, in lexical variation, and whether teachers moving from school to school might actually have an influence on the variation in the language. That is a very interesting question. One of the biggest problems we've faced when we have been looking at lexical variation, specifically in South African Sign Language related to different schools, is that we don't have very complete histories of the school. So firstly, we've got, information about how they were founded and what religious order founded them. So we have some ideas, but we don't know really where the teachers came from, and exactly this, whether teachers have moved from school to school and taken signs from one school to another. Anecdotally, we know there is some of this going on, and also kids change schools, right? So when children move from one school, one province to another, or from one school to the other, they will take signs with them. And also children are enormously creative and enjoy being creative. I mean, if anyone has children at school, of school going age, they know that they come home with very interesting words, new words. And it's the same with deaf children. So they create new signs a lot of the time on the playground to use with each other. So even from cohort to cohort, signs change. And in an age of social media, we've got even more scope for cross-pollination of lexical variants. So there is a feeling that we might see some natural standardization happening because of social media contact, because of materials developed for schools that use particular signs. And yeah, so there are lots of influences that go into lexical variation. Yeah.
Just mention one thing, which it's true for lexical variation, but also grammatical variation, that the majority of teachers in schools for the deaf are hearing. And the teachers who are actually teaching the classes South African Sign Language are good signers, that mostly. I'm looking at Simona's face, okay, on the whole, right? However, the teachers who are teaching other subjects, computer science, geography, other subjects, often have very limited skills in South African Sign Language. And what they do, they use what's called a sign system often. So they will use signs, but they will replace a word in their Afrikaans sentence or their English sentence with a sign. So they're using actually the grammatical structures of their spoken languages. We do not have data about this, unfortunately, as we said, not only the history of schools, but current status of the schools and policies and so on. It's not out there. And if you ask too many questions, it can be a bit difficult. So what we will try to do anyway is to see whether a school a participant has attended did have a mainly Afrikaans spoken language or a Xhosa spoken language or an English spoken language, and see whether that could have been possibly an influence. But it's quite, you can see there's quite a lot of factors to look at here. Yeah. Thank you for the question. That was nice. And Simona.
Thank you so much for that. I was wondering, you were saying that the lexical variation we find in sign language, specifically SASL, the percentage there or the how much variation you find is very similar to what we find in spoken languages. But I was wondering if you look at a country such as South Africa and the different English varieties of English that are spoken, and then they all write the same NSC. Am I speaking loud enough here? And they all write the same NSC exam with one specific variety that we would then call the standard or whatever. But it's usually not a problem for the, this is also, I don't have data, but it's usually not a problem for these English speakers to go and write the NSC. The variation between their different pieces of English isn't problematic. But if you think, I mean, just having started learning SASL, I'm always surprised at how much variation there is. So I'm excited about a sign that I've learned, and then all my colleagues have different signs, the first language SASL users. And obviously in a non-school context, that's fine. It's a problem for second language learners. It's not a problem for first language signers. But what about the school context? That just knowing what you've seen now from the variation in SASL, do you think this might be problematic for doing an SASL home language national senior certificate, like the NSC matric exam? Are these children at a disadvantage because they've all got these different varieties?
So I'm going to be politic and say what we don't know, Simona, quite seriously, what we don't know is to what extent, imagine you have one lemma like for Apple, and there are seven variants for Apple, to what extent those variants are understood by children for whom it's not their preferred variant. Right? If you think about your own understanding of other dialects, you wouldn't necessarily use a certain word, but you understand what it means if someone else uses it. And that is a very important aspect, which we're not able to tackle right yet, but we would love to. That is the mutual comprehensibility between the variants. Okay, yeah. So I think that has to be done before it can be absolutely stated whether there is a problem for an exam.
Yeah, so we know from anecdotal evidence that adult signers typically don't have a problem with the fact that there's a lot of variation, because they generally might be familiar with the other signs, but what we don't know is whether children are familiar with different signs. Yeah. So with spoken language, children are exposed to the same texts. So they read the same textbooks that use the same terminology, that use the same words, and the teacher uses the same words that then eventually appear in the exams that they write. What we don't know is whether that is the case for SASL. We know that materials are being developed, but are the same signs being used in the same school, in the schools? In the material the same? Are the teachers using the same signs? And if they're not, do the kids understand all the different variants? Yeah. So there's an enormous amount to unpack there.
Okay. More questions?
Yes.
Yeah, very uninformed novice in, not known to the theory. If a student from South Africa immigrates to China, is the language science so international that they can follow it, or because you're talking about South African sign language, is it difficult, or is there international basis of commonality?
So this is an important point to bring up. There isn't one universal sign language, right? So every country, every community of deaf people have their own sign language, and those sign languages are not mutually intelligible. Some sign languages that are related, for example, British Sign Language and Australian Sign Language are related, and they, in some contexts, can be mutually intelligible, but in the same way that, say, Afrikaans and Dutch might be mutually intelligible, but for the vast majority of approximately 300 sign languages in the world, I think it's around 300 sign languages, they're not mutually intelligible.
However, just to add to the story, deaf people who meet from different, and they're coming from different countries, and they want to get into conversation with one another, they will actually start doing, if you like, lexical deals. Okay, so I'm talking about beer, right? And the other person, you know, and might look a bit quizzically, and then there'll be a point, and then that person will use the sign that they use for beer. Now, there comes a negotiation, not explicit negotiation, but then one of the signs will be the sign that is used in that conversation. I was actually on the island of Crete and had met a British Sign Language signer on a walk, and he and I were invited to go to the Greek Deaf Club. We went, okay, I do not sign British Sign Language, I can sign Dutch Sign Language of the Netherlands and a little bit of South African Sign Language and my British Sign Language friend. We had a brilliant evening. We negotiated, we picked up the signs, and deaf people have this ability, probably trained through being in many situations where communication was difficult. So they negotiate. They don't sort of say, no, I'm not using that sign. It's very, and this is an ability and a flexibility which is there. So you can see the answer is slightly more complicated.
And just to add to that, there is also a sign system or sign communication called international sign, which is sort of a pidgin type language where a signer will use their own grammar, but they'll have an agreed upon lexicon of signs.
And this is a form of language which is used at conferences.
Yes, so it's used very much at conferences and international events. But it's not a natural sign language in the way that South African Sign Language or British Sign Language is.
There was Robin, you
Thanks for you both. I was wondering whether you looked at all at variation within schools in relation to school characteristics. I ask because there is some work relating like community size to language characteristics, like smaller communities tend to have more complex language, complex grammatical structures. I was wondering if in this case, there might be some relationship between the amount of variation and, for example, the size of the school. I don't know how much variation there is across schools in terms of their size. If they have some very big ones, some very small ones. Just curious about that.
It's an interesting question.
I know some research has been done in Mexico, I think, on this very question, whether the size of the sign language community has an effect on lexical variation, how much lexical variation there is in that community. But we haven't done anything. I'm not aware of anyone who's done anything in South Africa, but it's a very interesting question.
We will have hopefully the chance to compare the data from the Western Cape School in the project coming up with the Gauteng several schools, and we'll be able to possibly tease that aspect out, but we will have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's a good factor. We must make note.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. But the presentation of the social acquisition of sign language, find that effect among what was the sample? Was it school students?
Okay, so the effect. The question is effective age of acquisition or length of exposure. What the characteristics?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm getting at. I was just curious to see what.
About the two different factors. Okay, the two different factors. So age of acquisition and length of exposure are related because your length of exposure depends on when you started learning. So the data that or the participants that we've analyzed to date are largely young signers. So up until, mean age 20 or 22 in the two different projects. And so age-wise, they were quite comparable. And we actually, we did look at which was the stronger predictor of accuracy, whether it was age of acquisition or length of exposure. And we found that age of acquisition was more accurate at predicting accuracy than length of exposure. I would have to look at the paper to work out, to remember what the stats, but we did look at what factor was stronger, and it was age of acquisition. But again, we have a young deaf population, so 18 to 24, I think, 25, around there.
I mean, it really only becomes a confirm when there isn't a lot of variation in the age.
Yes.
A lot of the age, yeah.
But there was in that sample, the 15 that we did our pilot analysis on, there was quite a large range in age. So, it wasn't a bad pilot study, let's put it this way, but we need to confirm it with another sample, obviously. Yeah. Yes.
What's your point on this point of view? The factors that you took into account, a direct sentence, if the sentence is morally, politically, ideologically low, just thinking, what is the conversation speakers today's trying? And where do you stand, why play? How does the signer have an influence in the interpretation? His or her own morality or political views, whatever in the sign? How can you take
So this,
the sentence because it's the whole reading?
So the question is, whether the nature of the sentence itself affects the repetition, because if it's politically or emotionally or morally loaded, will the signer want to produce that sentence? We only had 20 sentences, and we made sure they were very innocuous, very simple sentences. They used basic vocabulary. So so we call the European frame of reference for learning a language has a category for vocabulary, and we use the basic category, so A1 and A2. So it's vocabulary that even little kids are exposed to. So it's nothing that has a sensitive topic, no sentences that would be, problematic from a moral or political standpoint. Precisely for this reason, you want people to be comfortable reproducing a sentence and not question the content of that sentence.
And we have to get through the ethics committee, so we have to actually, hand on heart say we did nothing to this.
So we have time for one last question.
Oh, no, that question has left me.
Oh, oh yes, we have a question there.
So you were talking about how the importance of age acquisition. I was wondering what the studies on the first project. You mentioned that 5 participants were born into a deaf family.
Yeah.
Did you find that those students were able to have greater proficiency because they were likely getting exposed to South African Sign Language?
Yeah, that was one of the findings of the ones who did 100%, for example, on non-manual markers. 3 out of the 4 were born into a deaf family.
Yeah, so of the 5, I think of the 5 signers who were born into the deaf family, did we analyze them all? I think we only analyzed data so far of 3 of the 5 participants who have been born into deaf families, and those 3 performed, their accuracy was 100%.
Yeah.
So yes, still very small samples, but it is telling.
Yes. Okay, but it's not a small sample because of our bad sampling. This is because so few deaf children are born into deaf families. So, it's 90% are born into hearing families. So,
and in Africa, it might even be higher.
Yes.
Closer to 95% of deaf children born into hearing families.
Well, thanks so much for your attention and good questions. It was lovely. And I hope you can go away feeling you know a little bit more.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to the interpreter. We appreciate.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Think about it.